Detective James Chen had spent 22 years working his way up through the police department, and finally, at 47 years old, he'd made it to police chief. It was a proud moment, one that his late father would have been thrilled about. To celebrate this milestone and his years of hard work, James did two things he'd been dreaming about for decades. First, he bought a beautiful house in Riverside Hills, one of those fancy gated communities with perfectly cut grass and expensive homes. Second, he'd finally finished restoring his dream car, a 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429 in this gorgeous bright blue color they called Grabber Blue. That Mustang meant everything to James. He and his dad had started working on it together 5 years ago, spending every weekend in the garage, getting their hands dirty and talking about life. When his father passed away 2 years back, James almost gave up on the project. But something told him to keep going, to finish what they'd started together. Every bolt he tightened, every part he restored felt like he was keeping his father's memory alive. Now the car was finally done, and it was absolutely beautiful. His first Saturday morning in the new house, James was out in his driveway doing what he loved most, taking care of his Mustang. He had a soft cloth in his hand, polishing the chrome bumper until it reflected the morning sun like a mirror. The weather was perfect, not too hot, with a gentle breeze. He was in his element, happy and content, thinking about how lucky he was to finally be living in a nice neighborhood where he could enjoy his retirement years when the time came. That peaceful moment didn't last long. James noticed a woman walking toward him with the kind of purposeful stride that usually meant trouble. She looked to be in her mid-40s, dressed in expensive workout clothes that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. She had these huge designer sunglasses covering half her face even though she was walking in the shade. Behind her was a teenage boy, maybe 17, wearing sneakers that James recognized cost around $300. The kid had his face buried in his phone, thumbs moving rapidly across the screen, completely oblivious to where he was walking. The woman didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just marched right up to James's driveway like she owned it, and stopped about 3 feet from where he was working. James straightened up, cloth still in hand, and tried to be friendly. He smiled and said hello, ready to introduce himself to his new neighbor. But before he could even say his name, the woman launched into what could only be described as a lecture. She introduced herself as Patricia Whitmore, the president of the Homeowners Association, though she quickly added that everyone called her Trish. But there was nothing friendly about the way she said it. No welcome to the neighborhood, no nice to meet you, nothing. She immediately started talking about rules. The HOA had very strict guidelines, she explained, and everyone in Riverside Hills was expected to follow them to the letter. There were rules about lawn height, about what colors you could paint your house, about where you could park your cars, about what kind of mailboxes were acceptable, and on and on. James listened politely, nodding occasionally, trying to be respectful, even though he found her tone pretty off-putting. He'd dealt with difficult people his entire career, so he knew how to keep his cool. But something about this woman rubbed him the wrong way. She talked to him like he was a child who needed to be told how to behave, not like a grown man who'd just bought a house in her neighborhood. She never once asked his name. She never asked what he did for a living. She never asked if he had a family or where he'd moved from. It was all just rules, regulations, and expectations. The whole time Patricia was talking, her son stood behind her, still glued to his phone. But James noticed something. Every so often, the kid would glance up from his screen and look at the Mustang. His eyes would linger on the car for a few seconds before going back to his phone. There was something in those glances, a kind of hunger or interest that James picked up on. He'd been a detective long enough to read people pretty well, and this kid was definitely interested in his car. Patricia went on for what felt like forever. She talked about the community standards, about maintaining the aesthetic of Riverside Hills, about how property values were everyone's responsibility. She mentioned that she'd been HOA president for 6 years and ran a tight ship. The way she said it, you could tell she was proud of being strict, proud of enforcing rules, proud of making sure everyone fell in line. James got the distinct impression that she enjoyed having power over her neighbors. Finally, after about 20 minutes of this one-sided conversation, Patricia wrapped up her speech. She pulled out a business card from somewhere in her expensive athletic jacket and handed it to James. The card was fancy, with raised lettering and a glossy finish. It had her name, her title as HOA president, and her contact information. She told him to call her if he had any questions about the rules, but the way she said it made it clear she expected him to follow the rules, not question them. As Patricia turned to leave, her son finally looked up from his phone completely. He stared at the Mustang for a long moment, and James saw him mouth the word nice before following his mother back toward their house. James watched them go, feeling a strange sense of unease settle in his stomach. Something about that interaction felt wrong, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. James looked down at Patricia's business card, then at his beautiful Mustang, then back toward the direction Patricia and her son had walked. He'd moved to Riverside Hills thinking it would be a peaceful place to enjoy the fruits of his labor, a quiet community where he could relax after decades of dealing with the worst of society. But standing there in his driveway, with Patricia's rules still ringing in his ears and the memory of her son's hungry stares at his car fresh in his mind, James had a sinking feeling that his new neighborhood might not be as peaceful as he'd hoped. He shook his head, trying to push away the negative thoughts. Maybe he was just being paranoid. Maybe Patricia was just one of those people who took HOA rules too seriously. Maybe her son was just a typical teenager who liked cool cars. James decided to give them the benefit of the doubt. After all, he was the new guy here. Maybe this was just how things worked in fancy neighborhoods like Riverside Hills. James went back to polishing his Mustang, but the joy he'd felt earlier was gone. He finished his work quickly and put his supplies away. As he headed into his house, he glanced back at his car one more time, admiring how it looked in the sunlight. That Mustang represented years of memories with his father, countless hours of hard work, and a dream finally realized. Whatever else happened in this neighborhood, James told himself, nobody was going to take that away from him. That car wasn't just a vehicle. It was a piece of his heart, and it wasn't going anywhere. Part 2. 3 days passed after that awkward first meeting with Patricia, and James was starting to settle into his new routine. He'd gotten up early that Tuesday morning and headed to the police station for his shift. Being police chief meant a lot of responsibility, but it also meant he could set his own schedule a bit. He preferred to arrive early and leave by late afternoon when possible. One thing James had always done, even before becoming chief, was change out of his uniform at work. He never liked wearing his badge and uniform around town when he wasn't working. It felt too formal, too intimidating. He wanted to be just another person when he was off duty. So that Tuesday evening, James drove home in his Mustang wearing just regular clothes, a pair of comfortable jeans and a plain polo shirt. Nothing about him screamed police officer. He looked like any other middle-aged guy coming home from work. He pulled into his driveway, turned off the engine, and was about to head inside when he heard footsteps behind him. Before he could even turn around, a voice said, "Whoa, dude, that's your car?" James turned to find Patricia's son standing right there, maybe 10 feet away. The kid wasn't looking at his phone this time. His eyes were locked on the Mustang, wide with excitement and interest. He walked closer without being invited, circling around the car like he was inspecting it at a dealership. James felt a little uncomfortable with how close the kid was getting, but he tried to stay friendly. The teenager introduced himself as Tyler. He was more animated than he'd been during that first encounter, talking fast and asking questions without waiting for answers. "Is this a real Boss 429? Where'd you get it? How fast does it go? What year is it?" Tyler reached out and ran his hand along the hood of the car, and James felt his jaw tighten. He didn't like people touching his Mustang without permission, especially strangers. James politely but firmly asked Tyler to please not touch the car. He explained that yes, it was a real 1969 Boss 429, and yes, he'd restored it himself over several years. Tyler pulled his hand back but kept circling the vehicle, peering through the windows, checking out the wheels, examining every detail. The kid clearly knew something about cars, which James could appreciate, but there was something about his intensity that felt off. Then Tyler said something that made James's blood run cold. "My birthday's next month. I'm turning 18. He paused, still staring at the Mustang like a kid staring at a toy store window. "My mom said I could pick any car I want as long as it's under $100,000. Tyler turned to look directly at James for the first time. "I want this one. I'll give you $80,000 for it right now. Cash. That's a really good deal for an old car like this." James stood there for a moment, genuinely shocked. He'd dealt with entitled people before, criminals who thought the world owed them something, suspects who tried to bargain their way out of trouble. But this was different. This was a 17-year-old kid standing in his driveway, having just met him 3 days ago, demanding to buy his car like it was a used bicycle at a garage sale. And he'd called it an old car like it was some worthless piece of junk. James took a deep breath and kept his voice calm and steady. He explained to Tyler that the car wasn't for sale. Not at $80,000, not at any price. He told Tyler about how he and his father had worked on this car together for years, how his dad had passed away before they could finish it, how completing the restoration had been James's way of honoring his father's memory. He tried to help Tyler understand that some things weren't about money, that this car had value that couldn't be measured in dollars. Tyler's whole expression changed as James spoke. The excitement drained from his face, replaced by something darker, confusion, then frustration, then anger. His eyes narrowed and his jaw set in a stubborn line. "Everything's for sale," Tyler said, his voice harder now. "I'm offering you good money. 80 grand for a car you probably paid way less for. Don't be stupid about this." James felt his own anger rising but kept it in check. Years of police work had taught him how to stay calm even when people were being incredibly rude. He simply repeated that the car wasn't for sale and turned to walk toward his front door. He was done with this conversation, but Tyler wasn't done. As James walked away, the kid called after him, loud enough for neighbors to hear. "You're making a huge mistake, old man. My mom runs this neighborhood. You have no idea who you're messing with." James stopped at his front door, key in hand, and turned back to look at Tyler. The teenager stood there in the driveway, fists clenched at his sides, face red with anger. For a moment, James considered saying something, maybe trying to teach this kid a lesson about respect and entitlement, but he decided against it. Tyler wasn't his problem to fix. James just shook his head, went inside, and closed the door behind him. That evening, James couldn't stop thinking about the interaction. He sat in his living room trying to watch television, but his mind kept replaying Tyler's words. "My mom runs this neighborhood." It wasn't just a bratty comment from a spoiled teenager. It was a threat. And James had been in law enforcement long enough to know that threats, even ones from 17-year-old kids, should be taken seriously. He thought about Patricia, about how she'd lectured him without even asking his name, about how she'd made it clear that she was in charge of Riverside Hills. He thought about Tyler's confidence, the way he'd assumed James would just sell him the car because he offered money, the way he'd gotten angry when told no. This wasn't a kid who'd been told no very often in his life. This was someone who'd learned from his mother that they could have whatever they wanted, that rules applied to other people but not to them. James had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. He'd met people like Patricia and Tyler before, during his career. Entitled, used to getting their way, unable to handle rejection. They were the kind of people who didn't just accept defeat and move on. They pushed back. They made life difficult for anyone who stood in their way. And according to Tyler, his mother ran this neighborhood, so which meant she had power here, at least in her own mind. Part of James wanted to ignore it, to hope that Tyler would forget about the car and move on to something else. But another part of him, the part that had spent 2 decades as a detective learning to trust his instincts, knew better. This was going to become a problem. He didn't know exactly how or when, but he knew it was coming. Before going to bed that night, James made a decision. He went to his home office and pulled out a notebook. On the first page, he wrote the date and a detailed account of both encounters with Patricia and Tyler. Everything from Patricia's lecture about HOA rules to Tyler's attempted purchase and subsequent threat. It was something he'd learned to do as a young officer. Document everything. Even when you didn't think you'd need it, write it down. Dates, times, what was said, who was there. You never knew when that information might become important. As James got ready for bed, he walked past his front window and looked out at his Mustang sitting in the driveway. The streetlight reflected off its blue paint, making it glow softly in the darkness. That car represented so much more than transportation. It was memories of his father, years of hard work, a symbol of dreams achieved. And he'd be damned if he'd let some entitled teenager and his pushy mother take that away from him. James had no idea just how ugly this situation was about to become, or how grateful he'd be that he'd started documenting everything. All he knew that night was that he'd made an enemy in his new neighborhood, and that enemy was the one person who supposedly had the most power there. It was going to be an interesting few months in Riverside Hills, that was for sure. Part 3. The first violation notice showed up 4 days after Tyler's attempt to buy the Mustang. James found it tucked into his front door, an official-looking document from the Riverside Hills Homeowners Association. He read it carefully, his police training kicking in as he examined the details. According to the notice, his mailbox was positioned 0.7 inches too far from the curb, violating Section 4.2 of the Community Guidelines. He had 7 days to correct the violation or face a fine of $200. James walked out to his mailbox and looked at it. He pulled a tape measure from his garage and checked the distance himself. The mailbox was exactly where the Postal Service had recommended it be placed, in the same position as every other mailbox on the street. He measured 3 of his neighbors' mailboxes and found that 2 of them were actually farther from the curb than his, but apparently they hadn't received violation notices. Just him. He added this to his documentation notebook, including measurements and photos. James had a pretty good idea who was behind this harassment, but he wasn't going to react emotionally. He'd dealt with bullies before, and the best way to handle them was to stay calm and keep detailed records. The second notice arrived 6 days later. This one claimed that parking his Mustang in his driveway violated the community aesthetic standards. According to Section 7.8, vintage or antique vehicles were considered potential eyesores and should be stored in garages, not displayed prominently in driveways. The notice stated he had 10 days to comply or face a $500 fine. James read this one twice, then read through his entire HOA rulebook that evening. Section 7.8 did exist, but it specifically referred to non-functional or deteriorating vehicles. His Mustang was in pristine condition, recently restored, and fully functional. The rule was being deliberately misinterpreted. He took photos of his Mustang and several other cars parked in driveways throughout the neighborhood, including a vintage Mercedes 3 houses down that had been sitting there since he moved in. The third notice came a week after that. His lawn was allegedly a 1/4 inch below the required minimum height of 2.5 inches. This violation notice included a threat that repeated offenses could result in the HOA hiring a lawn service at his expense. James went outside with a ruler and measured his grass in multiple spots. The average height was 2 3/4 inches, well above the minimum. Several of his neighbors' lawns were noticeably shorter than his. By this point, other neighbors had started approaching James. The first was an elderly man named Walter who lived 3 doors down. Walter came by one evening while James was checking his mail and spoke quietly, almost apologetically. "I'm sorry about what's happening to you," Walter said. "Patricia does this to anyone who crosses her. She drove out 2 families last year with this exact same tactic. Constant violation notices, harassment, making life miserable until people just give up and move." Over the next few days, James heard similar stories from other residents. A young couple mentioned how Patricia had targeted them for 6 months because they'd voted against one of her proposed rule changes. A retired teacher explained that Patricia had friends on the HOA board who did whatever she wanted, and that trying to fight her was nearly impossible. Everyone had the same advice: keep your head down, don't make waves, and maybe she'll eventually leave you alone. But James wasn't wired that way. He hadn't spent 22 years in law enforcement learning to back down from bullies. And this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about a person abusing their authority to make other people's lives miserable. And apparently, she'd been doing it for years without consequences. James started documenting everything with even more detail. He photographed every violation notice, measured what they claimed he'd violated, took comparison photos of neighbors' properties that clearly violated the same rules but received no notices. He started a timeline of events connecting Tyler's attempted purchase of the Mustang to the sudden flood of HOA violations. The pattern was obvious to anyone with investigative experience. 2 weeks into this harassment campaign, things escalated. James was working under his Mustang one Saturday afternoon, changing the oil. He had music playing from a small radio, and he was in a good mood despite all the nonsense with the HOA. The mechanical work relaxed him, reminded him of better times with his father. He heard voices approaching but didn't pay much attention at first. Then he recognized Tyler's voice, loud and obnoxious, clearly talking for his benefit. James stayed under the car, listening. Tyler was with 2 friends, all of them probably around the same age. They stopped near James's driveway, close enough that their conversation was impossible to ignore. "Can't believe this old dude won't sell," Tyler said, and James could hear the sneer in his voice. "I offered him way more than this piece of junk is worth." One of Tyler's friends laughed and said something about how stubborn old people could be. Then Tyler added, "Doesn't matter. My mom's making his life hell. She's really good at that. We always get what we want eventually. People always give in." The third friend, the one who hadn't spoken yet, said something that made James's hands tighten around the wrench he was holding. "Dude, these old Mustangs are so easy to hotwire. I watched a YouTube video about it. Takes like 2 minutes if you know what you're doing." All three of them laughed at that, and then James heard their footsteps moving away. He rolled out from under the car and watched them walk down the street, Tyler in the middle, all three of them glancing back and laughing. That comment about hotwiring wasn't just teenage bravado. That was a threat thinly veiled but clear enough. James felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't help, but being prepared would. That evening, James went online and ordered a professional security camera system. He spent the next day installing 4 cameras around his property, positioned to cover his driveway, front yard, and both sides of his house. The cameras were high quality, the kind that recorded in full color even at night, with motion detection and cloud storage. They were also discreet enough that you wouldn't notice them unless you knew where to look. Once the system was installed and tested, James felt a bit better. If Tyler or his friends tried anything with his car, he'd have video evidence. If Patricia ramped up her harassment campaign, he'd have documentation of anyone coming onto his property. He'd learned long ago that in any conflict, evidence was everything. The harassment continued, but James handled each violation notice methodically. He responded to each one in writing, providing photos and measurements that proved the violations were either fabricated or selectively enforced. He kept copies of everything. He remained polite but firm in all his communications with the HOA. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats, didn't give Patricia or anyone else ammunition to use against him. But inside, James was getting tired. He'd bought this house to enjoy his later years, to have a peaceful place to come home to after dealing with the stress of running a police department. Instead, he was spending his free time documenting petty harassment from a power-hungry HOA president and her entitled son. It was exhausting and frustrating, and there were moments when James understood why other families had simply moved away rather than deal with it. Still, every time he looked at his Mustang, he remembered why he was standing his ground. That car represented something that couldn't be bought or sold. It was principle, memory, and dignity all wrapped up in blue paint and chrome. If he gave in to Patricia and Tyler, if he let them push him around, what would that say about everything he'd stood for in his career? What would that say about all the years he'd spent standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves? James made a decision that night. He wasn't going anywhere. This was his home, his property, his car, and his life. If Patricia wanted a fight, she'd picked the wrong person. She thought she was dealing with just another neighbor she could bully into submission. She had no idea who she was actually dealing with, and James was content to let her keep thinking that, for now. As he went to bed that night, James checked his security camera system one more time on his phone. All 4 cameras showed clear views of his property, recording everything, ready to capture whatever came next. And James had a feeling that something was definitely coming next. Patricia and Tyler had shown him who they were. Now it was just a matter of time before they made a mistake big enough that even their status in this neighborhood couldn't protect them. Part 4 Sunday morning arrived with beautiful weather, the kind of day that made James grateful to be alive. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and he had no work commitments. He'd made himself a good cup of coffee and was sitting in his kitchen, reading the news on his tablet, when his phone buzzed with an alert from his security system. Movement detected in the driveway. James tapped the notification and pulled up the live camera feed. What he saw made his jaw clench. Tyler was in his driveway, walking around the Mustang slowly, looking at it from different angles. But he wasn't just looking this time. As James, Watched, the kid cupped his hands against the driver's side window and peered inside. Then Tyler reached down and tried the door handle, pulling on it to see if it was unlocked. James set down his coffee and walked to his front door. He opened it calmly and stepped outside. "Tyler," he called out, keeping his voice level. "Step away from my vehicle, please." The teenager jumped back, clearly startled that he'd been caught. But he recovered quickly, that teenage bravado kicking in almost immediately. "Relax, dude. I was just looking at it. It's not illegal to look at a car that's sitting in a driveway." Tyler crossed his arms defensively, trying to act like he'd done nothing wrong. James walked closer but maintained a reasonable distance. "It is illegal to attempt to open someone else's vehicle without permission," he said calmly. "That's attempted vehicle tampering. I'm asking you politely to leave my property and not come back unless you're invited." Tyler's face flushed red. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to say something nasty. But instead, he pulled out his phone and made a call. He kept his eyes on James the whole time, a smirk spreading across his face. "Mom," Tyler said loudly into the phone, "you need to come over here right now. That neighbor guy is threatening me." "Yeah, the one with the old car. He's being really aggressive. I'm scared." James almost laughed at the performance. Tyler didn't look scared. He looked smug, like he'd just played a winning card in a game. James just stood there calmly, hands at his sides, not saying a word. If Tyler wanted to play games, James had all day. Less than 5 minutes later, Patricia appeared. But she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a security guard in the official Riverside Hills uniform. The guard was a middle-aged Asian man, fit and professional-looking, with an expression that suggested he was already skeptical about whatever situation he'd been called to handle. Patricia didn't waste any time. She launched into a theatrical performance that would have been impressive if it wasn't so obvious. She claimed that James had verbally assaulted her son, that he'd been threatening and aggressive, that he'd used inappropriate language in front of Tyler. She went on to say that several neighbors had complained about James, that he was making people feel unsafe, that children were afraid to play outside when he was around. The security guard, whose name tag read Chen, looked between Patricia and James with growing skepticism. Everything about his body language suggested he'd dealt with Patricia before and knew what kind of person she was. But he was professional, asking questions and trying to get to the bottom of what actually happened. James remained completely calm through Patricia's entire rant. When she finally paused for breath, he spoke directly to the guard. "My name is James. I've lived here for about 6 weeks now. This is the first time we've met, Officer Chen, though I wish it were under better circumstances." He gestured toward Tyler. "This young man has been attempting to purchase my vehicle for several weeks. I've declined politely multiple times. This morning I observed him on my property, attempting to open my car door without permission. I have video evidence of this on my security system." Patricia's face went pale for just a second before flushing bright red. "He's lying. Tyler would never do that. You can't just make wild accusations against children." She turned to Officer Chen with desperate intensity. "This man is clearly unstable. I'm the HOA president, and I'm telling you that he needs to be removed from this property immediately. If you don't do your job and escort him out of here right now, I'll have you fired. Do you understand me?" Several neighbors had come out of their houses by this point, drawn by Patricia's raised voice. They stood on their lawns and porches, watching the scene unfold. James noticed Walter, the elderly man who'd warned him about Patricia, standing on his porch with his arms crossed, shaking his head. Officer Chen maintained his professional demeanor despite Patry. "She has threats. Ma'am, I appreciate your concerns, but I need to investigate the situation properly." "Sir," he turned to James, "you mentioned you have video evidence. Would you be willing to show me that?" James nodded. "Of course. I'd be happy to show you the footage. Would you like me to pull it up on my phone? Or would you prefer to come inside where you can see it on a larger screen?" Patricia practically exploded. "This is ridiculous. I am the president of this homeowners association. I have been for 6 years. I know every family in this neighborhood. This man just moved here and is already causing problems. You need to remove him now." Her voice had risen to almost a shout, and more neighbors were coming outside to see what all the commotion was about. Tyler, meanwhile, had gone quiet. He'd backed up several steps and was now standing behind his mother, looking far less confident than he had a few minutes ago. The smirk was gone from his face, replaced by something that might have been worry. Officer Chen pulled out a small notebook. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice, please." "Sir," he addressed James again. "Can I see some identification?" James nodded and reached for his wallet. This was the moment. He could feel it. Everything had been building to this point. Patricia was still ranting about her authority, about how she knew important people, about how this whole situation was absurd. Tyler was trying to disappear behind his mother. The neighbors were watching intently, and Officer Chen was waiting patiently for James to produce his ID. James pulled out his wallet and flipped it open, but he didn't pull out his driver's license. Instead, he produced his police credentials. His badge gleamed in the morning sunlight, and his official police chief identification card was clearly visible. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Officer Chen's eyes widened and he straightened up unconsciously. "Chief Rivera," he said, and there was clear respect in his voice. "I apologize, sir. I didn't realize." Patricia's mouth had literally fallen open. She stood frozen, staring at the badge in James's hand like it was a snake about to bite her. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking almost gray. Behind her, Tyler made a small sound that might have been a whimper. The neighbors who'd gathered started whispering to each other. James could hear snippets of their conversations. "He's a police chief? Did you know that? Oh, Patricia's in trouble now." Some of them were pulling out their phones, though whether to record the scene or text their friends about it, James couldn't tell. James kept his voice calm and professional. "Officer Chen, I appreciate you responding to this call. As I mentioned, I have video evidence of Tyler attempting to access my vehicle without permission this morning. I also have documentation of a pattern of harassment over the past several weeks, including multiple HOA violations that appear to be selectively enforced. In violation of fair housing practices." Patricia tried to backtrack immediately. Her voice was shaking now, all the anger and authority gone. I didn't know you were. This is all just a misunderstanding. I'm sure Tyler was only admiring the car. He loves vintage vehicles. He would never." But Tyler, panicking at the mention of potential legal consequences, blurted out, "I just wanted the car. You said we could have whatever we wanted. You said you'd make him sell it to me. You promised." He realized what he'd said a second too late, his hands flying up to cover his mouth. Part 5. The silence that followed Tyler's outburst was deafening. Patricia turned to look at her son with an expression of pure horror, realizing that he'd just confessed to their entire scheme in front of a police chief, a security officer, and at least a dozen neighbors. Tyler looked like he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole. Officer Chen cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, based on what I've heard and observed, I'll need to file an incident report about this situation. The security company will need to review your conduct in making what appears to have been a false report about Chief Rivera threatening your son." Patricia tried to salvage the situation, but her voice came out weak and desperate. No, that's not necessary. Like I said, this is all just a big misunderstanding. We're all neighbors here. We should be able to work this out like adults." She attempted a smile that came across more like a grimace. Walter, the elderly neighbor, spoke up from his porch. "I'd like to provide a statement if that's possible." Several other neighbors nodded and voiced their agreement. One woman, probably in her 50s, stepped forward. "I've been documenting Patricia's abuse of HOA authority for months. I have records of selective enforcement, harassment campaigns against multiple families, and misuse of community funds. I've been waiting for the right moment to file a formal complaint, and I think that moment has arrived." More neighbors came forward, each with their own story. A couple in their 30s talked about how Patricia had targeted them for 8 months because they'd painted their front door a shade of blue that Patricia personally didn't like, even though it was within the approved color palette. A retired veteran mentioned how Patricia had tried to fine him for displaying an American flag that she claimed was too large, despite there being federal laws protecting flag displays. The stories went on, painting a picture of years of systematic abuse of power. James listened to all of this with a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction, because Patricia was finally facing consequences for her behavior, but sadness because it was clear she'd made a lot of people miserable over the years, and they'd all been too afraid to speak up until now. Patricia kept trying to interrupt, to defend herself, to claim that she was just doing her job as HOA president, but her voice got weaker with each attempt, and eventually, she just stood there looking defeated and small, nothing like the commanding presence she'd been just minutes before. Officer Chen finished taking notes and turned to James. "Chief Rivera, do you wish to press charges against the minor for attempted vehicle tampering?" James looked at Tyler, who was now visibly shaking, his earlier bravado completely gone. The kid looked terrified and honestly young, just a teenager who'd been raised by a mother who taught him that rules didn't apply to them, that they could have whatever they wanted if they pushed hard enough. Tyler needed to learn a lesson, but James didn't think ruining his life with a criminal record was the right way to teach it. "No," James said finally, "I don't want to press charges. But I want it clearly documented that if there are any future attempts to access my property or my vehicle, I will pursue legal action, and I want it understood that the harassment needs to stop immediately." Relief flooded Tyler's face, and even Patricia looked grateful, though she was smart enough not to say anything. Officer Chen nodded. "That's very generous of you, Chief. I'll make sure this is all documented properly." James turned to address the gathered neighbors. "I also want to mention that the city's legal department might be interested in reviewing the HOA practices here at Riverside Hills. Based on what I've heard this morning, there may be violations of municipal codes regarding fair housing and proper governance of homeowners associations. I'm happy to provide contact information to anyone who wants to file a formal complaint." Several neighbors immediately expressed interest in that information. Walter was already pulling out his phone to take notes. The woman who'd mentioned documenting Patricia's behavior was nodding enthusiastically. Over the next hour, things slowly returned to a calmer state. Officer Chen finished his report and left, but not before privately telling James that Patricia had been a problem for the security company for years, and he was glad someone had finally stood up to her. The neighbors gradually dispersed, though many of them stopped by to introduce themselves properly to James and thank him for finally putting an end to Patricia's reign of terror. Patricia and Tyler left without another word, walking back to their house with their heads down. James watched them go and felt no satisfaction, just relief that it was over. He'd never wanted conflict. He'd just wanted to live in peace in his new home with his beloved Mustang. The aftermath of that Sunday morning unfolded over the next few months. Patricia resigned as HOA president within 2 weeks, citing personal reasons in her resignation letter. But everyone knew the real reason. The HOA board, under pressure from residents who'd been emboldened by James's stand, conducted an internal investigation into her conduct. They found multiple instances of selective rule enforcement, misuse of authority, and violations of the HOA's own bylaws. Tyler's situation was handled more privately. Patricia enrolled him in community service programs and arranged for counseling. James heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Tyler was actually responding well to these interventions, that he was beginning to understand how his entitled behavior had hurt others. James hoped that was true. The kid was young enough to change, to learn better ways of interacting with the world. The HOA held new elections, and Walter was elected as the new president. His first act was to repeal several of Patricia's more ridiculous rules, including the one about vintage vehicles being eyesores. The community immediately felt different, lighter somehow, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. James's Mustang remained parked proudly in his driveway every weekend. Other car enthusiasts in the neighborhood started introducing themselves, and soon James's house became an unofficial meeting spot for people who loved classic cars. They'd gather on Saturday mornings, drinking coffee and talking about engines and restoration projects. It was exactly the kind of peaceful, enjoyable retirement life James had hoped for when he bought the house. Officer Chen and James developed a friendly relationship. They'd meet for coffee occasionally, discussing community safety issues and sharing stories from their respective careers. Chen admitted that he'd been responding to Patricia's false reports for years, and had always suspected she was abusing the system, but he'd never had enough evidence to prove it until that Sunday morning. The most surprising development came about 3 months after the confrontation. James was working in his garage one Saturday when someone knocked on the doorframe. He looked up to find Tyler standing there looking nervous and uncomfortable. The teenager had grown his hair out a bit and looked somehow older than he had just a few months ago. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Tyler asked, his voice quiet and respectful, completely different from the entitled tone James remembered from their previous encounters. James set down his tools and gave Tyler his full attention. The kid apologized sincerely and without excuses. He explained that he'd been in therapy and was starting to understand how his behavior had affected other people. He talked about how his mother had raised him to believe that wanting something was the same as deserving it, that other people's feelings didn't matter as much as his own desires. He was learning that none of that was true, and he was trying to be better. James listened without interrupting, and when Tyler finished, he thanked him for the apology. They talked for a while about cars, about work ethic, about what it meant to be a good person. James could see that Tyler was genuinely trying to change, and he respected that. It took courage to admit you were wrong, especially for a teenager. Before Tyler left, he paused at the garage door. "Your Mustang really is beautiful," he said quietly. "I get now why you wouldn't sell it. Some things aren't about money. They're about what they mean to you." James smiled and nodded. The kid was learning. As the months turned into a year, Riverside Hills transformed into the kind of community James had hoped it would be when he first moved in. People looked out for each other. The rules were enforced fairly and reasonably. New families moved in and were welcomed properly, not lectured about regulations before anyone learned their names. The neighborhood felt like an actual neighborhood, not a dictatorship. James continued working as police chief, handling the responsibilities and stresses of the job. But now when he came home, he actually felt like he was coming home to a peaceful place. He'd park his Mustang in the driveway, and sometimes neighbors would wave or stop by to chat. On weekends, he'd work on the car, maintaining it, improving it, keeping alive the memories of his father that were embedded in every bolt and panel. Looking back on the whole situation, James realized that standing up to Patricia and Tyler had been about more than just protecting his car or his property. It had been about showing an entire community that bullies only have power when good people stay silent. Once someone found the courage to speak up, others found their courage too. And together they'd taken back their neighborhood from someone who'd held it hostage for years. The Mustang still sat in James's driveway, gleaming in the sun, a symbol not just of his memories and his hard work, but of principle, dignity, and the importance of standing up for what's right. And every time James looked at it, he felt grateful not just for the car itself, but for everything it represented and everything it had taught him about his new community and the good people who lived there. Retry.